On a humid evening in June 2005, the small town of Albertville, Alabama was winding down for the night. Streetlights flickered on a long Main Street. Families finished dinner. Teenagers made plans for the weekend ahead. It was ordinary in every way except one. By morning, a 16-year-old girl would be missing, and the lie that followed would hold firm for nearly a decade. What no one could have predicted was that the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, protected not by cleverness, but by something far more powerful, trust that was never questioned. Before we go any further into this story, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. These are stories about what happens to people when the truth gets buried under silence and time. The question I want you to think about as we go through this is simple: how long would you wait for an answer if someone you loved disappeared without a trace? Albertville sits in Marshall County, in the northeastern part of Alabama, tucked between Sand Mountain and the Tennessee River Valley. In 2005, the population hovered around 17,000. It was a working-class town, known for its poultry plants and its high school football team. People knew their neighbors. Churches were full on Sundays. Crime, especially violent crime, was rare enough that when it happened, it rattled everyone. 16-year-old Bethany Ann Porter was a sophomore at Albertville High School. She was small for her age, barely 5 feet tall, with long brown hair she usually wore in a ponytail. She was shy around most people but came alive around the few she trusted. Her teachers described her as conscientious, the type of student who never missed an assignment even if she rarely raised her hand in class. She loved animals, spent hours sketching them in the margins of her notebooks, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian someday. Bethany lived with her aunt, Margaret Porter, in a modest ranch house on the south side of town. Her mother had passed away from cancer when Bethany was 11. Her father, a long-haul truck driver, had decided he couldn't raise a daughter on his own and had asked his sister to take her in. Margaret, unmarried and in her early 40s, had agreed without hesitation. She worked as a secretary at a law firm downtown and did everything she could to give Bethany a stable home. The two of them had settled into a comfortable routine. Bethany helped with chores, kept her grades up, stayed out of trouble. Margaret gave her space but always knew where she was. They ate dinner together most nights. They watched game shows on television. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that had always been enough. On the evening of June 10, 2005, Bethany told Margaret she was going to meet a friend at the public library to work on a summer reading assignment. School had let out for the year just a week earlier, and Bethany had signed up for an advanced English course that required students to read and report on 3 novels before the fall semester began. Margaret thought it was a good idea. Bethany had always been responsible about her schoolwork. Bethany left the house around 6:30. She was wearing jean shorts and a yellow tank top. She grabbed her backpack, which held a notebook and a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She told Margaret she'd be back by 9. Margaret reminded her to call if she was going to be late. Bethany smiled and said she would. That was the last time Margaret saw her niece. By 9:15, Bethany hadn't come home. Margaret called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She waited another 15 minutes, telling herself that Bethany had probably lost track of time, that the library closed at 9 and she was likely walking home right now. But by 9:40, with still no sign of her, Margaret got in her car and drove to the library. The building was dark. The parking lot was empty. Margaret's chest tightened. She drove around the surrounding streets, scanning sidewalks and storefronts, looking for any sign of her niece. She stopped at the convenience store across from the library and asked the clerk if he'd seen a teenage girl matching Bethany's description. He hadn't. By 10 o'clock, Margaret was back home, pacing the living room, calling Bethany's cell phone over and over. Each time, it went to voicemail. She called the few friends whose numbers she had. None of them had seen Bethany that evening. One girl said she didn't even know Bethany was planning to go to the library. At 10:30, Margaret called the Albertville Police Department. The officer who took the call was polite but not particularly alarmed. A teenage girl, a few hours late, no signs of trouble. He took down Bethany's description, asked Margaret for a recent photo, and told her that in most cases like this, kids turned up within a few hours. Maybe Bethany had gone somewhere else. Maybe she'd met up with friends and forgotten to check in. Margaret insisted that wasn't like her niece, that Bethany always called, always kept her word. The officer said he understood, but that they needed to wait a bit longer before filing an official missing person report. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch with the lights on, staring at the front door, willing it to open. By morning, Bethany still hadn't come home. Margaret called the police again, and this time, they took it more seriously. An officer came to the house, took a detailed statement, collected a photo of Bethany, and began making calls. By midday, a missing person report had been filed, and the search had officially begun. The first place investigators checked was the library. They spoke with the staff, reviewed the sign-in logs, looked at the security footage from the entrance. Bethany's name wasn't in the log. The footage showed no sign of her entering or leaving the building that evening. As far as anyone could tell, she'd never made it to the library at all. That realization shifted the investigation immediately. If Bethany hadn't gone where she said she was going, then where had she gone? And more troubling, had she lied to Margaret about her plans, or had something happened to her on the way? Detectives began canvassing the route between Margaret's house and the library. They knocked on doors, talked to neighbors, asked if anyone had seen a teenage girl walking alone that evening. A few people remembered seeing a girl who might have been Bethany, but no one could say for certain. One man recalled seeing a girl in a yellow shirt near the intersection of Main and 6th Street around 7 o'clock, but he hadn't paid close enough attention to describe her beyond that. Investigators checked with Bethany's friends again, pressing harder this time. Had Bethany mentioned meeting anyone? Had she seemed upset or distracted recently? Was there a boyfriend, someone Margaret might not have known about? The answers were all variations of the same thing: Bethany kept to herself. She didn't date. She didn't go to parties. If she had secrets, she hadn't shared them. The search expanded. Volunteers from the community joined police in walking the streets, checking parks, combing through wooded areas on the outskirts of town. Flyers with Bethany's photo were posted on every telephone pole and storefront window. Local news stations ran segments asking anyone with information to come forward. Margaret appeared on camera, her voice breaking, pleading for her niece to come home. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. There were no credible sightings. No ransom calls. No signs of where Bethany had gone or what had happened to her. It was as though she'd simply vanished. On June 24, 2 weeks after Bethany disappeared, a man walking his dog in a wooded area off County Road 28, about 6 miles outside of Albertville, noticed something unusual. A piece of yellow fabric was caught on a low-hanging branch near a creek bed. He walked closer and saw a backpack half buried in mud and leaves. He called the police. Within an hour, investigators were on the scene. The backpack was Bethany's. Inside, they found her notebook, waterlogged but still recognizable, and the copy of To Kill a Mockingbird she'd been carrying. Her cell phone was there too, the battery dead, the screen cracked. But Bethany herself was nowhere to be found. The area was immediately sealed off. Search teams moved through the woods in grids, using dogs and volunteers to cover every inch of ground. The creek was shallow, barely a foot deep in most places, but it ran for miles, cutting through dense forest and private farmland. If Bethany had been there, if something had happened to her in those woods, finding her would take time. It took 3 days. On the afternoon of June 27, a searcher found Bethany's body in a culvert beneath an old logging road, approximately a quarter-mile downstream from where her backpack had been discovered. She was lying face down in the water, her clothing torn, her body showing signs of trauma. The medical examiner later determined that Bethany had died from blunt force trauma to the head. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She had been struck multiple times, likely with a heavy object, possibly a rock or a piece of wood. The examiner estimated she'd been dead for at least 2 weeks, likely since the night she disappeared. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Bethany's jewelry, a small silver necklace her mother had given her, was still around her neck. Whatever had happened to her, robbery didn't appear to be the motive. The question that haunted everyone was the same question that had been there from the start: why had Bethany gone out to those woods in the first place? And who had been with her when she died? The town of Albertville reacted with a grief that was almost suffocating. Vigils were held. The high school organized a memorial service. Bethany's classmates wore yellow ribbons in her honor. Margaret was devastated, barely able to function, surrounded by people offering condolences that felt hollow because nothing could bring her niece back. But beneath the grief, there was fear. A 16-year-old girl had been murdered, and no one knew who was responsible. Parents started driving their children everywhere. Curfews were enforced. Strangers were watched with suspicion. The sense of safety that had defined Albertville for so long was gone. Detectives worked the case with everything they had. They interviewed dozens of people. They looked at known offenders in the area. They re-examined Bethany's final days, searching for anything that might explain why she'd ended up in those woods. But every lead turned cold. Every theory fell apart under scrutiny. One name that kept surfacing, though, was Aaron Mitchell. Aaron was 19 years old in 2005, a recent graduate of Albertville High School. He'd grown up in town, came from a well-regarded family. His father was a deacon at the Baptist church. His mother taught elementary school. Aaron himself had been a decent student, played on the baseball team, worked part-time at his uncle's auto repair shop. He was polite, friendly, the kind of young man adults trusted. And he'd known Bethany. They'd gone to the same church for years. Aaron had been in youth group when Bethany first started attending with Margaret. He was a few years older, had graduated by the time Bethany entered high school, but they knew each other. They'd talked occasionally after services. Aaron had helped set up chairs for a church potluck Bethany attended. People had seen them speaking, nothing unusual, nothing that raised eyebrows. Just two people from the same community being friendly. When detectives brought Aaron in for questioning, he was cooperative. He confirmed that he knew Bethany, that they attended the same church, that he'd spoken to her a handful of times over the years. But he said he hadn't seen her recently, hadn't talked to her in weeks, had no idea why she disappeared or what had happened to her. He said he'd been at home the night of June 10th, had dinner with his parents, watched television, went to bed early. His parents confirmed the alibi. They said Aaron had been home all evening, hadn't left the house, hadn't received any calls or visitors. Detectives checked Aaron's phone records. There were no calls or texts to Bethany. No digital trail connecting them. Nothing that suggested any recent contact. They looked at his vehicle, a pickup truck he used for work. They found no blood, no physical evidence, nothing that tied him to the crime. They searched his room at his parents' house. Nothing. Aaron was released. He wasn't considered a suspect, just someone who'd known the victim and needed to be ruled out. To the investigators, there was no reason to doubt his story. But there was one small detail that didn't quite fit, a detail so minor that it barely made it into the case file. A clerk at a gas station on the outskirts of town told police that on the evening of June 10th, she'd seen a pickup truck that looked like Aaron's parked near the entrance to County Road 28 around 8 o'clock. She couldn't say for certain it was his truck, couldn't even say for certain what day it had been. Memory, especially after the fact, is unreliable. The detail was noted and set aside. The investigation dragged on through the summer and into the fall. Tips came in, most of them leading nowhere. A man in a neighboring county reported seeing a girl who looked like Bethany at a truck stop. It wasn't her. Someone called in an anonymous tip suggesting a local handyman had been involved. He had an alibi. Every possible angle was explored and exhausted. By the end of 2005, the case had gone cold. Margaret struggled to accept it. She couldn't understand how someone could kill her niece and just disappear, how there could be no answers, no justice, no accountability. She attended every community meeting, every police briefing. She kept Bethany's room exactly as it had been. She refused to let go. But as the years passed, the attention faded. The news stopped covering the story. The flyers came down. People in Albertville stopped talking about Bethany Porter, not because they'd forgotten, but because it hurt too much to keep remembering. Life went on, the way it always does, even when it feels like it shouldn't. Aaron Mitchell went on with his life too. He continued working at the auto shop. He took community college classes. He started dating a girl from a nearby town. In 2007, he got engaged. In 2008, he got married. By all outward appearances, he was a normal young man building a normal life. But for nearly a decade, the truth of what happened to Bethany Porter remained buried. What would eventually break the case open wasn't new evidence. It wasn't a forensic breakthrough. It wasn't even a detective's sudden insight. It was something much simpler and much more human, a lie that finally became too heavy to carry. In 2013, Aaron Mitchell's marriage fell apart. The reasons were complicated, the kind of slow disintegration that happens when two people realize they don't know each other as well as they thought. His wife, a woman named Emily, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Aaron's temper, his need to control where she went and who she spoke to, his sudden mood swings that seemed to come from nowhere. She'd tried to make it work, had gone to counseling with him, had hoped things would improve. But they didn't. In the spring of 2014, Emily filed for divorce. Aaron didn't take it well. He became angry, defensive, accused her of betraying him. The split was bitter, filled with arguments and accusations. And in one of those arguments, late one night in their apartment, Aaron said something that would change everything. Emily would later tell investigators that Aaron had been drinking. They'd been fighting about money, about the division of their belongings, about who would keep the apartment. The argument had escalated. Emily had accused Aaron of never being honest with her, of always hiding parts of himself she couldn't reach. And that's when Aaron, his voice tight with anger, had said, "You don't know what I've had to live with. You don't know what it's like to carry something you can't undo." Emily had asked him what he meant. Aaron had stared at her for a long moment, his face pale, and then he'd said a name. Bethany Porter. Emily had frozen. Everyone in Albertville knew that name, even people who'd moved to town years after the murder. Bethany's case was part of the town's history, a tragedy that lingered in the collective memory. Emily had asked Aaron why he'd brought up Bethany. Aaron had looked away and said, "Because I think about her every day." Then he'd walked out of the room. Emily hadn't slept that night. She'd lain awake, replaying the conversation in her mind, trying to understand what Aaron had meant. Was he saying he felt guilty because he'd known Bethany and hadn't been able to help? Or was he saying something else, something darker? The next morning, Emily had tried to bring it up again, but Aaron had shut down completely. He'd said he didn't want to talk about it, that he'd been drunk and upset, that she was reading too much into nothing. But Emily couldn't let it go. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Aaron had been confessing to something. She waited until the divorce was finalized. She didn't want to do anything that might complicate the legal proceedings, didn't want Aaron to accuse her of lying to hurt him in court. But once the paperwork was signed and she'd moved out, once she was safely away from him, Emily went to the police. She walked into the Albertville Police Department on a Tuesday morning in late May 2014 and asked to speak to someone about the Bethany Porter case. The detective who met with her was a man named Paul Hendricks. He was in his 50s, had been with the department for nearly 30 years, and had worked on Bethany's case when it first happened. He'd never forgotten it. Cold cases had a way of staying with you, especially when the victim was a kid. Emily told Hendricks everything. The argument. What Aaron had said. The look on his face when he'd mentioned Bethany's name. She admitted she couldn't prove Aaron had done anything wrong, but she felt strongly that someone needed to know. Hendricks listened carefully. He took detailed notes. He didn't dismiss Emily's concerns, but he also didn't jump to conclusions. What she described wasn't a confession. It was vague, open to interpretation, the kind of statement that could mean anything or nothing. But it was enough to make Hendricks want to take another look at Aaron Mitchell. He pulled the old case file, reviewed the interviews, the timelines, the alibis. He saw the note about the gas station clerk who'd thought she'd seen Aaron's truck near County Road 28 on the night Bethany disappeared. That detail, which had seemed insignificant 9 years earlier, suddenly felt more important. Hendricks decided to re-interview the clerk. Her name was Diane Fuller, and she still worked at the same gas station. When Hendricks showed her a photo of Aaron's truck and asked if it looked familiar, she studied it for a long moment and then nodded. She said she remembered that truck. She said she'd seen it more than once parked near the entrance to County Road 28 in the evenings, usually around dusk. She couldn't say exactly when, but it had been around the time that girl went missing. She'd mentioned it to police back then, but no one had followed up. Hendricks asked Diane if she'd ever seen who was driving the truck. She said she hadn't, not clearly. But she remembered thinking it was odd that someone would park there so often. There was nothing out that way except woods and farmland. Hendricks began digging deeper into Aaron's background. He talked to people who'd known him in high school, people who'd worked with him, people from the church. Most described him as quiet, reliable, nothing out of the ordinary. But a few people mentioned that Aaron had always seemed a bit too interested in the younger girls at church events. Nothing inappropriate, nothing anyone had reported, just a vague sense that he paid more attention to them than seemed normal for someone his age. One former youth group leader remembered that Aaron had volunteered to help chaperone a church camping trip when Bethany was 14. The leader had thought it was odd at the time because Aaron had already graduated and wasn't technically part of the youth group anymore, but he'd been enthusiastic about helping, so they'd let him. The leader said Aaron had spent a lot of time talking to Bethany that weekend, helping her set up her tent, sitting next to her at the campfire. Nothing had happened, but looking back, it seemed strange. Hendricks also spoke with Emily again, asking her to remember anything else Aaron might have said or done that seemed off. Emily mentioned that Aaron had always been uncomfortable when Bethany's name came up in conversation, which wasn't often, but when it did, he'd change the subject or leave the room. She'd thought he was just sensitive about local tragedies. Now she wondered if it was something else. The more Hendricks learned, the more convinced he became that Aaron knew more than he'd ever admitted. But knowing and proving were two different things. Hendricks needed something concrete, something that could break through Aaron's denials and force the truth into the open. He decided to bring Aaron in for another interview. In June 2014, 9 years after Bethany's death, Hendricks called Aaron and asked him to come to the station to answer a few follow-up questions about the case. Aaron agreed. He seemed calm, cooperative, like someone who had nothing to hide. When Aaron arrived, Hendricks started with the basics. He asked Aaron to go through his relationship with Bethany again, to describe how well he'd known her, when he'd last seen her. Aaron repeated the same story he'd told 9 years earlier. He'd known her from church. They'd talked a few times. He hadn't seen her in the weeks before she disappeared. He'd been home the night she went missing. Then Hendricks asked about the truck. He told Aaron that multiple witnesses had placed a vehicle matching his truck near County Road 28 around the time Bethany disappeared. He asked Aaron if he could explain that. Aaron's expression shifted. Just slightly. He said he didn't remember being out that way, but he supposed it was possible. He drove around a lot for work. Maybe he'd been on a service call. Maybe someone was misremembering. Hendricks pressed. He asked Aaron why he'd mentioned Bethany's name to Emily during their argument. He asked what Aaron had meant when he'd said he thought about her every day. Aaron went quiet. He looked down at the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he'd felt guilty for years because he could have done more to help find Bethany. He said he should have joined the search efforts, should have been more involved, but he'd been scared and young and didn't know what to do. He said that's what he'd meant when he talked to Emily. Just guilt. Just regret. Hendricks let the silence sit. He waited. And then Aaron said something that changed the entire trajectory of the conversation. He said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." Hendricks asked him what he meant. Aaron looked up, his eyes red, and said it again. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Over the next hour, Aaron Mitchell confessed. He confessed to everything. He told Hendricks that he'd been infatuated with Bethany for years, ever since she'd started coming to church. He'd thought she was beautiful, thought they had a connection, thought that maybe, when she got a little older, she'd see him the way he saw her. He'd volunteered for youth group activities just to be near her. He'd found excuses to talk to her, to help her with things, to make himself useful in her life. But Bethany had never shown any interest. She'd been polite, friendly in a distant way, but nothing more. And as she'd gotten older, as she'd started high school, Aaron had realized she was never going to feel the way he wanted her to feel. On the evening of June 10, 2005, Aaron had been driving around town, restless and frustrated. He'd seen Bethany walking along Main Street, heading toward the library. He'd pulled over and offered her a ride. She'd hesitated but had accepted. He was someone she knew, someone from church. She'd trusted him. Aaron had told her he needed to make a quick stop, that he had to pick something up from a friend's property out on County Road 28. Bethany had agreed to ride along. She'd probably thought it would only take a few minutes. But when they'd gotten out to the woods, Aaron had parked and started talking. He'd told Bethany how he felt about her, how long he'd cared about her, how much he wanted to be with her. Bethany had been uncomfortable. She'd told him she didn't feel that way, that she thought of him as a friend from church, nothing more. She'd asked him to take her back to town. Aaron had gotten angry. He'd felt humiliated, rejected, like all the years of waiting and hoping had been for nothing. He tried to touch her arm, and Bethany had pulled away. They'd argued. Bethany had tried to get out of the truck, and Aaron had grabbed her. She'd fought back, scratching at his face, trying to get free. Aaron said he didn't remember all the details after that. He remembered being furious, remembered Bethany screaming, remembered picking up a rock from the ground and hitting her. He remembered her falling. He remembered the silence that followed. When he'd realized what he'd done, he'd panicked. He'd tried to hide the body, dragging Bethany into the culvert beneath the logging road, covering her with branches. He'd thrown her backpack into the woods, hoping it would make it look like she'd been attacked by someone else, a stranger, a random act of violence. Then he'd driven home. He'd gone inside, washed his hands, sat down with his parents, and watched television like nothing had happened. For 9 years, he'd carried that secret. For 9 years, he'd told himself he could live with it, that he could move on, that eventually the guilt would fade. But it never had. Every time he heard Bethany's name, every time he saw Margaret at church, every time he thought about what he'd done, the weight of it crushed him a little more. He said he'd wanted to confess 100 times. But he'd been too afraid. Too ashamed. Too convinced that if he stayed quiet, no one would ever know. But staying quiet had cost him everything. His marriage. His peace. His sense of self. And now, sitting across from Detective Hendricks, Aaron Mitchell finally admitted that he couldn't carry it anymore. Hendricks arrested him that day. The charge was murder. If you believe Bethany deserved someone who would never stop fighting for the truth, hit that subscribe button. Trolls won't. But people who understand that silence protects the guilty and wounds the innocent, those are the people who make sure stories like this are never forgotten. The arrest sent shockwaves through Albertville. Aaron Mitchell, the polite young man from the good family, the church volunteer, the kid everyone thought they knew, was a murderer. People who'd trusted him, who'd prayed alongside him, who'd welcomed him into their homes, had to reconcile the person they thought he was with the person he'd always been. Margaret Porter, who'd spent 9 years wondering who had killed her niece, finally had an answer. It didn't bring Bethany back. It didn't undo the years of grief and uncertainty. But it was an answer. And after all that time, that mattered. Aaron's confession was detailed enough that prosecutors felt confident moving forward. They had his admission, corroborated by evidence that had been sitting in the case file for years, waiting for someone to see it clearly. The gas station clerk's account. The timing. Aaron's own words. In early 2015, Aaron Mitchell was formally charged with murder in the first degree. His defense attorney tried to argue that the confession had been coerced, that Aaron had been emotionally unstable after his divorce, that he'd said things he didn't mean. But the evidence, combined with Aaron's own detailed account of what had happened, made that argument difficult to sustain. Facing the overwhelming likelihood of conviction, Aaron accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Margaret Porter stood before the court and spoke directly to Aaron. She told him that he'd stolen her niece's life, stolen the future Bethany should have had, stolen nearly a decade of peace from her own life by staying silent. She told him she would never forgive him, not for killing Bethany, and not for letting her suffer for 9 years without answers. Aaron kept his head down. He didn't speak. He didn't apologize. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs and taken to prison, where he remains today. The resolution of Bethany's case brought a measure of closure to Albertville, but it also forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths. How had Aaron gone unnoticed for so long? How had no one seen the signs? How had his lie held firm for nearly a decade? The answer, painful as it was, came down to trust. Aaron had come from the right kind of family. He'd said the right things. He'd seemed like the kind of person who couldn't possibly be capable of violence. And so, when detectives had questioned him in 2005, they believed his alibi. When the gas station clerk had mentioned seeing his truck, the detail had been noted and dismissed. When Aaron had continued living his life, going to church, getting married, building a future, no one had looked twice. It was a failure not of effort, but of imagination. The detectives who'd worked the case originally had done their jobs. They'd followed leads, interviewed suspects, pursued every angle they could find. But they'd never seriously considered that the polite young man from the Baptist church could be a killer. And that blind spot had allowed Aaron to hide in plain sight for 9 years. Detective Paul Hendricks, reflecting on the case after Aaron's conviction, acknowledged that mistakes had been made. He said that the detail about the truck should have been investigated more thoroughly. He said that Aaron should have been pressed harder during the initial interviews. But he also said that hindsight was easy, that in 2005, with the information they'd had, Aaron hadn't seemed like a viable suspect. What ultimately broke the case wasn't better detective work. It wasn't new technology or a sudden insight. It was Aaron's own inability to carry the weight of what he'd done. The lie had collapsed not because someone discovered it, but because it became too heavy to hold. In the years since Aaron's conviction, Albertville has tried to move forward. Bethany's story is still remembered, still taught as a reminder of what can happen when trust goes unquestioned, when red flags are dismissed, when silence is allowed to stand in place of truth. Margaret Porter has become an advocate for families of cold case victims. She speaks at community events, works with law enforcement agencies, and pushes for policies that ensure cases are regularly reviewed, that old evidence is re-examined, that detectives are encouraged to question assumptions no matter how solid they seem. She's met other families who've lived without answers, and she's found purpose in helping them navigate the same painful uncertainty she endured for nearly a decade. Bethany's case also changed how the Albertville Police Department approaches unsolved homicides. The department now mandates that cold cases be reviewed every few years by fresh investigators, that alibis be re-examined, that small details that seemed insignificant at the time be reconsidered in light of new information. Detective Hendricks has trained younger officers to look beyond the surface, to understand that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who seem dangerous. Would Bethany's case have been solved without Emily coming forward? It's impossible to say. Maybe Aaron would have carried his secret to the grave. Maybe the guilt would have eaten at him until he confessed on his own. Maybe another piece of evidence would have surfaced years down the line. There's no way to know. What is certain is that the truth, once buried under a lie that seemed unshakable, finally came to light. And that mattered. It mattered to Margaret. It mattered to the community. It mattered to everyone who'd ever wondered what happened to the quiet 16-year-old girl who disappeared on her way to the library. Because in the end, Bethany and Porter got justice. It came nearly a decade too late. It came only after years of silence and suffering. But it came. And for a family that had spent 9 years living in the worst kind of uncertainty, that was everything. Right now, as this story unfolds, what time is it where you're listening from? Bethany's story forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about how we see people. We want to believe that we can tell who's dangerous and who's safe. We want to believe that evil announces itself, that killers look a certain way, act a certain way, come from certain kinds of families. But Bethany's case proves that's not true. Aaron Mitchell didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a helpful young man from a good family. He sounded like someone you could trust. And because of that, because he fit the profile of someone who couldn't possibly be guilty, he was able to hide for nearly a decade. The lesson Albertville learned, the lesson that communities across the country continue to learn, is that trust should never come at the expense of scrutiny. That politeness and respectability are not the same as innocence. That the most dangerous lies are the ones we want to believe. For Margaret, the resolution of Bethany's case didn't erase the pain. How could it? Her niece was still gone. The years of not knowing, of wondering, of waking up every morning with the same unanswered question, those years couldn't be undone. But she had a name now. She had an answer. And she had the knowledge that Bethany's killer would never walk free, would never hurt anyone else, would spend the rest of his life paying for what he'd done. That wasn't everything. But it was something. Bethany Ann Porter was 16 years old when she died. She should have graduated high school. She should have gone to college, studied veterinary medicine, spent her life caring for animals the way she'd always dreamed of doing. She should have fallen in love, maybe gotten married, maybe had children of her own. She should have had decades of life stretching out in front of her, decades of experiences and memories and moments that were stolen from her on a June evening in 2005. Instead, she became a name on a missing person report. A case file. A cold case that sat unsolved for nearly a decade. Until she wasn't. Her story, painful and unfinished as it is, stands as a testament to the fact that truth doesn't disappear just because someone tries to bury it. It can be hidden. It can be obscured. It can take years or even decades to surface. But it remains, waiting for the moment when the lie becomes too heavy to carry, when the right person asks the right question, when silence finally breaks. Aaron Mitchell is serving his sentence in an Alabama state prison. He'll die there. He'll never know freedom again. He'll never build the life he tried to construct on top of Bethany's grave. And every day he spends behind bars is a reminder that some debts can never be repaid, that some choices echo forward through time in ways that can never be undone. The people of Albertville who knew Aaron still struggle with what his confession meant. How do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the person who was always there beneath the surface? How do you trust your own judgment after discovering you were so completely wrong? There are no easy answers to those questions. The church where Aaron and Bethany both worshipped held a service of remembrance after his conviction, a quiet gathering meant to honor Bethany's memory and to acknowledge the community's collective failure to see what was happening in their midst. The pastor spoke about the danger of assuming goodness based on appearance, about the responsibility everyone has to look deeper, to ask harder questions, to never let comfort replace vigilance. Some families left the church after that. The weight of what had happened there, the knowledge that a killer had sat among them for years, praying and volunteering and acting like he belonged, was too much to bear. Others stayed, determined to rebuild, to learn from what had happened, to make sure nothing like it could happen again. Margaret still attends that church. She sits in the same pew she and Bethany used to share. People have asked her how she can stand to be there, how she can worship in the same building where Aaron once stood. Her answer is always the same: Bethany loved this place. Leaving would mean letting Aaron take that from her too. That kind of strength is difficult to comprehend. To lose someone you love, to spend nearly a decade without answers, to finally learn the truth and discover it was someone you'd seen every Sunday, someone you trusted, someone who'd smiled at you and your niece as though he were just another member of the community, and then to choose to stay, to refuse to be driven away, to insist on your right to grieve and remember in the place that mattered to the person you lost. Margaret's resilience became a model for other families dealing with cold cases. She showed that you could survive the not knowing, that you could keep fighting even when it seemed hopeless, that you could demand accountability even when the system seemed to have moved on. And when the answers finally came, when the truth finally surfaced, she showed that you could accept it without letting it destroy you. Bethany's case also had implications beyond Albertville. Other police departments in Alabama began reviewing their own cold cases with fresh eyes, looking for small details that might have been dismissed, questioning alibis that had seemed solid at the time, reaching out to witnesses years after the fact to see if memories or circumstances had changed. Several cases that had been dormant for years were reopened. A few were eventually solved. The ripple effects of one confession, one detective's persistence, one ex-wife's courage to come forward, spread further than anyone could have predicted. Truth has a way of doing that. Once it breaks through in one place, it creates openings elsewhere. It shows people that resolution is possible, that time doesn't necessarily mean the end of accountability, that even decades-old cases can still yield answers if someone is willing to look. What haunts people most about Bethany's case isn't the violence itself, though that's terrible enough. It's the time. 9 years. 9 years during which Aaron went to work, went to church, got married, celebrated holidays, lived a normal life while Bethany's family lived in agony. 9 years during which he could have ended their suffering with a single admission but chose not to. 9 years during which he prioritized his own freedom, his own comfort, his own future over their right to know what had happened to someone they loved. That choice, to stay silent for so long, is in some ways harder to forgive than the act of violence itself. Violence can happen in a moment of rage, a loss of control, a terrible mistake that can't be taken back. But silence is a choice made over and over again, every single day, for years. It's a sustained decision to value yourself over the people you've harmed. Aaron's eventual confession didn't come from remorse, at least not primarily. It came from his own inability to bear the weight anymore. He confessed because the lie was crushing him, not because he'd suddenly developed empathy for Margaret or Bethany's friends or the community he'd terrorized with uncertainty. Even his confession was, in a sense, about himself. That's a bitter truth to accept. But it's important to accept it, because it reveals something fundamental about how these cases get solved. Often, it's not justice that brings the truth to light. It's the perpetrator's own weakness, their own need to unburden themselves, their own inability to continue pretending. Justice comes after, as a consequence. But the initial break almost always comes from human frailty. Detective Hendricks understood that. When he brought Aaron in for questioning in 2014, he didn't approach it as an interrogation. He approached it as an opportunity for Aaron to finally stop carrying what he'd been carrying. He gave Aaron permission, in a sense, to tell the truth. And Aaron, exhausted and broken by his own choices, took it. That doesn't mean Aaron deserves sympathy. It doesn't mean his suffering was equivalent to Margaret's or Bethany's. But it does mean that the resolution of cold cases often depends on understanding the psychology of guilt, on recognizing that people who commit terrible acts often live in their own kind of prison long before they're ever arrested, and that sometimes, if you approach them at the right moment with the right question, they'll open the door themselves. Bethany Ann Porter's case is now closed. The file sits in an archive somewhere, marked Solved, a testament to persistence and painful truth. Margaret has a copy of the final report, though she's never read all of it. She doesn't need to know every detail of what happened to her niece in those final moments. Knowing who and knowing why is enough. She keeps Bethany's photo on her mantle still. In it, Bethany is smiling, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes bright with a future she would never see. Margaret talks to that photo sometimes, tells her niece about her day, about the advocacy work she's doing, about the families she's helping. She tells Bethany that she's proud of her, that she misses her every single day, that the world is smaller and quieter without her in it. And she tells her that the person who took her life will never take her memory. That's what justice looks like when it comes 9 years too late. It's not triumphant. It's not satisfying in any simple way. It's complicated and painful and insufficient. But it's real. It's accountability. It's truth replacing silence. It's a name finally spoken without fear or uncertainty. And for a family that spent nearly a decade living in the dark, even imperfect justice is better than no justice at all. There's a memorial bench in Albertville now, in the small park near the library where Bethany was supposed to go that June evening. It's a simple wooden bench with a brass plaque that reads, "In memory of Bethany Ann Porter. May her light continue to shine." People sit there sometimes, students studying, elderly couples resting, parents watching their children play. Most of them don't know who Bethany was. But the ones who do, the ones who remember, they sit there and they think about a 16-year-old girl who deserved so much more than she got. And they remember that truth matters. That accountability matters. That no amount of time can erase the obligation to seek justice for those who've been wronged. These stories are for people who believe the human spirit doesn't break, even after decades of silence. People like that don't look away. Rest in peace, Bethany. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. Because here's what cases like Bethany's teach us: the danger isn't always the stranger. Sometimes it's the person everyone thinks they know. And the real tragedy isn't just the violence itself, it's how easy it is for lies to survive when no one thinks to question them. I'll see you in the next one.